Comstock and Debbie Dingell. But first, let's bring in Peter Ducey live in Birmingham, Alabama with the latest on the special election. Peter.
Chris, the Senate candidate everybody has been talking about hasn't been seen in days. No events for Judge Roy Moore so far this weekend, but the Republican accused of sexual misconduct by multiple women is hoping to get by with a little help from President Trump and his friends. Election Eve in Alabama will feature a robocall from President Trump and a rally headlined by his former chief strategist, Steve Bannon. In a statement to Fox, the deputy campaign manager for the Moore campaign, Hannah Ford, says, quote, "Turnout is the key to victory, and we have pulled all hands on deck to activate Judge Moore's conservative and evangelical base. Our volunteers are on fire for the truth and are determined to stop pro-abortion, pro-taxes, pro-amnesty liberals from stealing their Senate seat." The Democrat Doug Jones is counting on heavy African-American turnout to flip the Senate seat Jeff Sessions held for 20 years and called in two potential 2020 contenders on Saturday, former Massachusetts Governor Deval Patrick and New Jersey Senator Cory Booker, to help him beat up Roy Moore with suggestions that he wouldn't represent every Alabamian who asks for help.
Taking constituent calls, not caring if they're black or they're white. Don't let me get in trouble now if they're gay or they're straight. It's about representing all of the people.
Something that's been overlooked lately, the write-in candidate. Many voters here still plan to write in their preferred Republican, even though nobody ever staged a formal write-in campaign, which means there are countless wild cards in this race. Chris?
Peter Ducey reporting from Birmingham. Peter, thanks for that. Back here in Washington, we're joined now by Republican Congresswoman Barbara Comstock of Virginia and Democratic Congresswoman Debbie Dingell of Michigan. And welcome both of you to Fox News Sunday. Let's start with Judge Moore and the Senate election in Alabama. On Friday night, President Trump spoke in Pensacola and gave Moore his full endorsement. Here it is.
We can't afford to have a liberal Democrat who is completely controlled by Nancy Pelosi and Chuck Schumer. We can't do it. So get out and vote for Roy Moore.
Congresswoman Comstock, does that bother you as a Republican to see President Trump and the Republican National Committee both supporting Judge Moore, who faces several allegations of misconduct with teenage girls, one as young as 14?
Well, I was one of, I think, the first Republican woman to call for him to step aside. I was happy to see my friends like Senator Cory Gardner, who heads up the Senatorial Committee, Tim Scott, and many others, take the other side of that and say that we don't need to have him here. Now, the voters are going to decide on Tuesday, but I think what they're going to have is an ethics investigation. And what we've been doing on my committee is we've been hearing the voices of the women and the victims. And that is what is going to happen, because every woman has a story. Jeff Sessions said he believed these women. And I think if Roy Moore doesn't underperform like he has in the past, and he's here, he'll be facing the Ethics Committee.
But I want to ask you directly, does it bother you as a Republican Congresswoman to see President Trump and the Republican National Committee supporting Roy Moore?
Yes, I mean, it doesn't represent me. I don't think it represents most of the Republican women, as well as my colleagues like Senator Tim Scott and others and Cory Gardner have made clear.
Congresswoman Dingell, Democrats moved fast this week to push both John Conyers, your fellow congressman from Michigan, and Al Franken, senator from Minnesota, to step down. And there are signs that your party is trying to seize the moral high ground on this issue. Take a look.
Where is their outrage? In fact, on the opposite end, they're coming forward to support Roy Moore. How's that for totally inappropriate positions?
Is there a difference in how the two parties are handling this issue of sexual harassment and among members of Congress, and is that a legitimate issue in the 2018 campaign?
I think that the voters are going to hold everybody accountable, whether you're Republican or Democrat, when the 2018 campaign happens. This has probably been was the most difficult week of my career. When you look at somebody like John Conyers, who had the legacy that he did, have to step aside. But this has been going on for a very long time, Chris. We know what our values are. I don't consider this a partisan issue. I find it I mean, Barbara and I totally agree on this issue. I've also called that I think Congressman Farenthold should resign. $84,000 is a lot of money, and it wasn't for nothing. We cannot have a double standard. And we still have somebody running for office. We still have somebody in the White House that has acknowledged that they have done things that are not okay, or at least the president has. So it's disturbing. But we have to know who we are, and I think we're all going to be held accountable, next Republican or Democrat, next November.
But do you see a difference in the president and Roy Moore on the one hand and pushing out Conyers and Franken on the other, and Democratic leaders demanding that they leave?
I think that everybody's got to be accountable. So I think those that aren't making, I mean, there are, as you've seen, sitting at this table, Republicans are calling for this man to step down, and Republicans have even criticized the president for what he did. I think we know what our values are. I think we know what we stand for, and I think the American people are going to hold people accountable next November.
It's been clear from the past month these issues aren't partisan. They've been in the media, they've been in entertainment, and that's why we took a look in Congress. I'm on the Committee of Jurisdiction. We were looking at this issue even before some of these stories came forward, because we knew if we were seeing what we saw in media, in the entertainment industry, and across all industries, that it was going to be in Congress too. And that's why we're going to change the procedures. We've already passed resolution, my bill on having mandatory training, and we know there's a lot more that we need to do both in Congress as well as with the public at large. So I think it's important, as Debbie said, that this not be seen as partisan, because it's a watershed moment where men and women are coming together across the partisan divide to change the culture here, and that's why you're seeing people leaving, Democrat and Republican. There's still some Democrats and Republicans there who have been asked to leave, who haven't left yet, but this is still going to be playing out. But let's focus too on the women and their stories, because we need to see what their stories are and how we can make them whole. And that's the real problem here, is that women have been denied their careers because of these men in power, and it's a power abuse, not really about sex so much as power abuse. I want to
talk about that. We'll talk about reforms in a moment, but let's review what we have seen on Capitol Hill just recently. Excuse me, 3 members of Congress resigned this past week. 3 more have either settled sex harassment cases or face allegations. Congresswoman Dingell, how widespread do you think this problem is? I've heard reports that as many as 30 or 40 members of the House and Senate may face allegations of sexual harassment.
I'm hearing those same rumors. The numbers grow each week. I don't know what the truth is, and I'm not going to deal in speculation. I'm going to tell you what I'm the most worried about, which is, and Barbara touched upon this, the only reason I didn't wander into it. I know this issue is very personal to me, but this isn't real. Everybody says this is a watershed moment. Is this really a watershed moment if it's not real for the tip waitress or the factory worker or somebody in a law firm or a teacher or a nurse or a doctor? And we need to look at the way that even those who have the courage to come forward in the last few weeks have been treated and been demonized. And that has been the people, we're all trying to wrap our head around this. It's happening so fast, and they're names that some had heard, some didn't know. We need to make sure that we come out of this, men and women together, changing the culture, working together as we go forward. So we've got to make sure that women who do have the courage to come forward aren't hurt, that their careers are not hurt, they're treated with respect, and those that, and we have fair processes, and we are improving workplaces across the country.
People have been shocked to learn, excuse me, how Congress handles sex harassment cases. And let's put some of this on the screen. There's a 90-day process, including counseling and a cooling off period before a staffer can file a complaint. The Office of Compliance has paid out more than $17 million in taxpayer funds to secretly settle workplace complaints, not all of them, but certainly some of them, about sex harassment. Congresswoman Comstock, you're working on legislation. What do you want to see? How much do you want to streamline that process for women to file complaints? How much disclosure, transparency do you want to see for people who have settled complaints in the past? And should we be naming past people, or should they somehow be protected?
No, I think we should be naming past people, and that should be fully disclosed. I think we may need to have maybe an outside counsel come in to totally review any of these cases to make sure we get that all out there. So I do fully support it. But also the priority needs to be on the victims and fundamentally changing the system so that the victims feel they have a process that works for them and advocates for them. So we've been advocating either having a counsel or an ombudsman or some type of advocate that protects the victims so they feel there's a system that allows them to come forward. But I think first we have to know who in the past, and those names should be disclosed. They're going to come out one way or the other, and they should. As you mentioned, all of that fund is not at all for sexual harassment. So whatever is sexual harassment should come forward, and I believe it will, and I support it. I also support non-disclosure, for them not having to honor those non-disclosure agreements. The woman in the Alcee Hastings case contacted my office. I spoke with her this weekend. She's already speaking out, and we need to make sure that women like her will be protected to come forward and talk, and I fully support protection for those women.
I got less than a minute left. Congresswoman Dingell, is this going to change? I mean, it's pretty easy to pass this resolution. Everybody has to get training. But are we going to see a real change in the way Congress handles these cases and the naming of people who have settled these at taxpayers' expense in the past?
I think
that there is total concurrence that there must be transparency and that we should never use taxpayers' money to pay for somebody's irresponsible, just despicable, unacceptable behavior. Though I think everybody's trying to figure out how do you make sure that you take care of the survivor and that the survivor doesn't have consequences. Too much of this has consequences. And going forward, Chris, we need a conversation in this country that needs to happen at dinner tables, in churches, in barbershops, in every place across the country. Men and women and families have got to work together on this.
All right. Thank you. And we do need to point out that this is not just about members of Congress, although that certainly is egregious. It's in all businesses, including our own. Congresswoman Dingell, Congresswoman Comstock, thank you both for coming in today.
Thank you.
Up next, we'll bring in our Sunday group to discuss how big an issue the sex harassment scandal may turn out to be in the 2018 midterm elections.
I, of all people, am aware that there is some irony in the fact that I am leaving while a man who has bragged on tape about his history of sexual assault sits in the Oval Office, and a man who has repeatedly preyed on young girls campaigns for the Senate with the full support of his party.
Al Franken taking a parting shot at President Trump and Roy Moore in his resignation speech on the Senate floor. And it's time now for our Sunday group. Former Speaker of the House, Newt Gingrich, Charles Lane of the Washington Post, Rachel Bade, who covers Congress for Politico, and the head of Heritage Action for America, Michael Needham. Well, Democratic women moved with stunning speed on Wednesday to demand that Al Franken step down. Here's a sample.
Enough is enough. I mean, this is a conversation we've been having for a very long time, and it's a conversation that this country needs to have.
It was really difficult for each of us to come to this point, what I would call a tipping point for each of us.
Speaker Gingrich, I think it's fair to say that you're no fan of Al Franken, but you had an interesting reaction to him being pushed out. You said this, quote, "This is a party which is losing its mind," talking about the Democrats. "They suddenly curled into this weird puritanism, which feels a compulsion to go out and lynch people without a trial." Question, why was this a lynching?
He's never faced his accusers. He's never had due process. He's never had an opportunity to clear his name. Suddenly, and then you saw it in the way you described it, suddenly all the social pressure of the left wing of the Democratic Party came together, made it inappropriate for him to stay. Now, 1 million people had elected him, and 30 people decided he was inappropriate. Now, they haven't decided yet that Bob Menendez, by the way, who has a much more interesting story to tell, is inappropriate. This is purely and simply hysteria.
Is it also politics? I mean, it was interesting because I asked the two congresswomen, they backed away from that. But do you think they're Democrats trying to make this an issue?
Maybe between, I was told by a reporter who really tries to pay attention to stuff, that to some extent the blowback on Nancy Pelosi when she tried to defend John Conyers was so intense from the left that everybody else on the left suddenly said, got it, lynch mobs are in this week, let's go lynch somebody, Franklin's available. The part of the thing amazing to me is here's a guy who wrote #1 bestseller, Giant of the Senate, supposedly a very funny book. He's a comedian. We all know he's a comedian. He was a comedian before he ran. And he just crumbles under the social pressure. I mean, there was no objective force to kick him out. He wasn't going to be expelled. He just couldn't take the social ostracism.
Chuck, Democratic Senator Tim Kaine said that we've got a new standard here and that people who are elected to office will be judged, among other things, on their behavior before they took office. Do you have any problem with the pressure on Franken to resign? Was this, as the Speaker says, a lynching?
I think it's highly inappropriate to call anything like this a lynching when you think about the history of what actual lynchings really were in this country. Having said that, I would add that I think for a lot of women, they may feel like, well, you know, when in the past these things came up, there wasn't so much speed about addressing the complaints, that they got swept under the rug. What we're into right now, though, as these sort of extreme points of view show, is a situation where, contrary to Senator Kaine, there isn't a new standard. There's a shifting standard. There is not an established rule here either about what a fireable offense is or what the procedure should be, and at the end of the procedure, what the punishments should be. So I think, you know, what the Democrats politically are trying to do by ousting Franken is establish we are consistent. We are the party that, you know, means what it says and says what it means. I would suspect that's going to be very difficult, actually, to sustain a consistent view of this, because every case is going to be a little different, and the politics are going to change constantly. And I think that was the wisdom of your two guests when they said this isn't a partisan matter, because truthfully, as cases come along, you're going to see it's very hard to be consistent about this.
Let me just pick up with Rachel, because you cover Congress. As you watch what was unfolding in the Senate on Wednesday, when all of the Democratic women senators called for him to leave and then a lot of the men followed, how much of this was genuine outrage and how much of it was whether it was because of the Pelosi or whatever, a decision, we're going to distinguish ourselves from the Republicans and Trump and Roy Moore and make this an issue for 2018?
I think it was both. From what we were hearing, these women in the Senate had been talking and texting about Franken, and they were uncomfortable with what the stories they were hearing, and there was sort of this agreement that if one more credible accuser came forward, they would all jump together and ask him to resign, and that's what you saw happen. However, I do think politics is seeping into this. Democrats have long sort of fashioned themselves as the party of women, and right now they're trying to show their base that they don't only espouse these verbally, but they act on these as well, and they're going to try to claim they have the moral high ground when 2018 comes and say, we pushed our members out who had this issue. However, I do not think this is just Democrats, of course, right? You have a president who is embracing a candidate in Alabama who has been accused of child molestation, right? I know there's a bunch of Republicans on the Hill who are very uncomfortable with this and think that he's only doing this because of politics. And I think that that's why you saw Speaker Paul Ryan today push out one of his own members, Trent Franks of Arizona, over allegations that he also had sexually harassed women.
Well, let's talk about Roy Moore. Here's an ad that an outside group is running against Moore in Alabama right now.
I want decent people in office. That's why I can't vote for Roy Moore. What he's done and what he stands for makes us Republicans and us Christians look bad.
Michael, talk about the politics of the Roy Moore thing in terms of the sexual harassment issue. Also, does Moore win? And if he wins, will the Republicans in the Senate refuse to seat him or vote to expel him, which we heard a lot of talk about in the beginning, we're not hearing so much about now?
Yeah, I think it looks like Roy Moore will win, and I think it looks like they'll have a Senate ethics investigation if he comes there, and I think Roy Moore should welcome that. He will be a more effective legislator if these allegations can be investigated, if the truth can come out, if that's not something that hangs over him, and the entire United Senate can be more effective at legislating if rather than every time you walk down the hall, you have to talk about this, that, or the other, and instead can point to an investigation. It relates to Al Franken. I mean, the other thing that didn't come out in this conversation about Al Franken is that Al Franken had absolutely no interest in being a serious legislator. He introduced 141 pieces of legislation amendments. Not a single one in his entire career, including time with a Democrat president, was ever signed into law. Al Franken was a mean-spirited bulldog who had no purpose in the United States Senate if he couldn't be a mean-spirited bulldog, which he couldn't do with these allegations out there. He wasn't interested in being a legislator before. He isn't interested in being a legislator now, and I think that's part of why he stepped down, and he stepped down without even having the grace to say that he's sorry or apologize for any of this.
So let me just point out, not an Al Franken fan?
That's exactly
right. We have to take a break here. We'll see you all a little later. Coming up, tensions flare over President Trump's decision to recognize Jerusalem as Israel's capital. We'll report on the latest. And we'll talk with the U.S. ambassador to the United Nations, Nikki Haley, about the fallout. That's next. President Trump broke with decades of U.S. policy this week and set off protests around the world by declaring the United States now recognizes Jerusalem as the capital of Israel. In a moment, we'll discuss the move with Nikki Haley, U.S. ambassador to the United Nations. But first, let's get the latest from Connor Powell in Jerusalem.
The violence so many predicted was likely to occur following President Trump's unilateral decision to recognize Jerusalem as Israel's capital continued for a fifth straight day. As demonstrators in Beirut and Jakarta marched on the U.S. Embassy early Sunday morning. In the Palestinian territories, protesters clashed with security forces at Israeli checkpoints in Bethlehem and other Palestinian cities. 2 Palestinians have been killed and more than 1,000 injured, while the Israeli Air Force launched airstrikes in Gaza following the launch of rockets by Hamas. 2 militants were killed. But it's not just Muslim and Arab countries protesting President Trump's decision. Secretary of State Rex Tillerson faced a barrage of criticism in Europe this week. From France to Great Britain to Turkey, some of America's closest allies demanding answers why the White House made this decision now, receiving nothing in return that would move the peace process forward. Vice President Pence will arrive here in the Holy Land for a visit next week, and already Palestinian leaders are saying they won't meet with him, believing the U.S. has crossed a red line with this decision that undermines past American efforts to act as an honest broker of peace here. Chris?
Connor Powell reporting from Jerusalem. Connor, thank you. Joining me now, the U.S. ambassador to the UN, Nikki Haley. Let's start with President Trump's reasoning in making this move. Here he is.
This is a long overdue step to advance the peace process and to work towards a lasting agreement.
Ambassador, how does recognizing Jerusalem as the capital of Israel and starting to move our embassy there specifically, how does that advance the peace process?
Well, first of all, you have to, just say what's realistic. I mean, Jerusalem is the capital of Israel. That's why the parliament's there, the Supreme Court's there, the president and the prime minister are there. So the United States has always had its embassy in the capital city, and so Israel should be no different. There have been presidential candidates on both sides of the aisle that have all said that Jerusalem is the capital of Israel. And so what we have said is, enough talking about it, let's do it. This is the will of the American people. The president wanted to follow through. Presidents Bush, Clinton, and Obama all said they were for it, but never did anything about it. And this president said it's time. And we think this is actually going to help us fastball the peace process going forward.
But I've got to tell you, I don't have to tell you that President Trump's decision is being criticized from all corners. Let's just take a quick rundown. Palestinian leader Abbas calls it a declaration of withdrawal from the peace process. British Prime Minister May calls it unhelpful in terms of prospects for peace in the region. Pope Francis expressed profound concern. Question, what are Abbas and May and even the Pope missing?
Leaders understand that courage is important, and we don't do things just to please every other country in the world. We do things to advance the ball, and that's what the president did with this. He said, this is time that we acknowledge reality. It's been 22 years in the making. It was time. And not only that, Chris, it's the right thing to do. It's the right thing to do. Israel should be no different. We didn't set any parameters. We didn't say this was the final status. What we said is we're going to do like we do in every other country, and we're going to put the embassy in its capital, and we're going to continue. And our are going to continue that fact that we are as committed to the peace process as we've ever been before. And we're going to keep going until we get it.
I want to pick up on something you said in that last answer. Are you suggesting that despite President Trump's decision to recognize Jerusalem as the capital, to begin to move the embassy there, that the final status of Jerusalem is still up for negotiation, that in a negotiation, East Jerusalem could still end up as the capital of the Palestinian state? And again, if so, why make this move now?
Well, I think the president, if you notice in his speech, he made a point not to talk about borders or boundaries. What he did was say that Jerusalem is the capital of Israel and that we're moving our embassy there, because he strongly believes that those final status issues should be decided between the Palestinians and the Israelis. No outside group should decide what the final status looks like, and we're leaving it up to them to do that. At the end of the day, they have to be comfortable with the peace process and the resolution that we come up with. We just want to support them in that process.
So again, specifically, East Jerusalem, if that's the result of the negotiation, East Jerusalem could still be the capital of a Palestinian state.
We will respect anything that the two parties come together on.
I want to talk about something else that happened this week. You spoke before the UN Security Council when they met on this subject, and you called out some of your fellow ambassadors. Here you are.
Over many years, the United Nations has outrageously been of the world's foremost centers of hostility towards Israel. The UN has done much more damage to the prospects for Middle East peace than to advance them.
Why, Ambassador, why was that helpful?
Because it's the facts. I mean, ever since I have gotten to the United Nations, there have been repeated attempts to hit Israel for no reason whatsoever. It's Israel bashing sessions, constantly trying to find ways to pick at them, and we've seen that start to diminish. But I want the Security Council and all of the international community to understand, when you bully Israel, you are not helping the peace process. And we see Israel as one of our best allies. We're not going to put up with it anymore. So when we see it, we call them out on it. It's time for them to realize that all of these things they've done to Israel have only hurt the process. We need to treat Palestinians and Israelis fairly. We need to hope that they both come together for a peaceful solution, and we need to support both of them. That has not happened for years in the United Nations, but it's starting to happen now.
Now, there has been a suggestion of a resolution to criticize or condemn the president's move in the Security Council. Of course, you would veto that, so the suggestion is perhaps it would be the UN General Assembly that would pass a resolution. What would the U.S. reaction be to that?
Oh, I would have a strong reaction to that. We have the right to do whatever we want in terms of where we put our embassies. We don't need other countries telling us what's right and wrong. And, you know, what I have always said is, if we are honest, if we tell the truth, that's when peace comes. And this was the president telling the world the truth. And this was him going through with the will of the American people who had asked for 22 years to get this done. And he had the courage to show it, and I think a lot of Americans have a huge sigh of relief because of it. And now, hopefully, we can see the peace process really come together.
I want to change trouble spots in the world on you, which is part of your job, because at the same time, the United States is calling on the rest of the world, the United Nations, to impose and force sanctions against North Korea. You say that the world has cut off 90% of trade with North Korea, but only 30% of oil to North Korea. And I guess my question is, after all the efforts President Trump has made to cajole China, to pressure China, why is it that Chinese President Xi is not doing more?
Well, I think what we are seeing is that China is actually following through with the sanctions. They are, as is the international community. And I'll tell you, when we talked about leadership earlier, the United States is the one that led the entire international community to basically oust North Korea and say that they had to denuclearize and cut everything off. So we've done a great job at doing that. China has followed through on the sanctions, but to be clear, China can do more. And we're putting as much pressure on them as we can. The last time they completely cut off the oil, North Korea came to the table. And so we've told China they've got to do more. If they don't do more, we're going to take it into our own hands, and then we'll start to